You're listening to Rock the Schools.
I am Van Jones, and I listen to Rock the Schools because education is power.
With Citizen Stewart.
I'm Beth Hawkins, and I support Rock the Schools.
I am Titi Layo Bidiaco, and I support
Rock the Schools because education is power.
And thank you for your support.
Well, good day, good listeners. This is Chris Stewart with another edition of Rock the Schools with Citizen Stewart. Today, my very special guest is Julian Vasquez Heilig. He's an award-winning teacher, researcher, and blogger. He's currently the professor of educational leadership and policy studies and the director of the Doctorate in Educational Leadership program at Cal State, Sacramento. We invited him on the show for a variety of reasons. A lot of times on this show, I speak to the choir. I speak to people who already agree with me. It's not really a tough conversation when you only talk to people who are in the choir, who agree with you already. Quite obviously, Dr. Vasquez Heilig is the opposite of me in a lot of education policy discussions. I'm for choice. He has deep suspicions about choice. I'm for charter schools. He has deep suspicion of charter schools. I'm generally for what is called education reform, although I don't like the term anymore. And I think Dr. Heilig Vasquez, or Vasquez Heilig, I'm sorry, is deeply suspicious of many of the reforms. So let's kick it off. Let's have a discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be back, and glad you were able to also come out and spend some time with us here on campus at Cal State Sacramento a few weeks ago, too.
Yeah, I didn't love the rain. I don't come to California for rain, but, you know, coming in from the Midwest, I was hoping that you guys would have some sunshine for me. But it was a good discussion. It was a great debate. I should tell my listeners I went out to Sacramento, and we debated are vouchers and charter schools the answer? I was for the motion with some qualifications. And Dr. Vasquez Heilig was against the motion, voted against the motion. So at the outset, let's just talk a little bit about democracy in education, because it's something that you spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about nationally. What do we mean when we use the word democracy as connected to education?
Oh, that's a big intro. I think that we have since education became required by law about 100 years ago, when we decided that as a public good, we would provide all students a public education. This has been an ongoing debate. And then there's sort of tributaries in that debate about curriculum, about assessment, about governance of schools. And so the question is, what is the role of the public in educating its populace? What is the role of the public in educating its citizens in a democratic form of government? So, these are long-standing debates that go back, to the early part of the last century when we decided that every kid would have the opportunity to go to public education, at least until high school.
So what I don't understand, usually when I hear it, I often hear democracy as conflated to mean a school board, like a local school board. I'm a former urban school board member. If you would have talked to me the day before I joined the school board versus the last day when I came off, I was two different people, right? So on my first day, I was pretty much a civilian, and I felt like a citizen. I felt like, I believed in a lot of the institution. On my last day, I had become very jaded because of what I saw. Many things that I saw that took place were anti-democratic. I would ask myself the question almost every day, if the public only knew half of how this runs and how this operates, what would happen? So are you making, in a very practical sense, are you saying that a school board, locally elected school board, is one of the manifestations of real democracy in schools?
But what's the alternative? Aristotle, when he first started when the Greeks first invented democracy, said that there would be a constant debate about how democracy functions. But in a democracy, we can have those debates. What's happened, I think, with school reform is that it's become more of a plutocracy, which is that the power of these conversations, the power of these decisions has become concentrated. Barack Obama is speaking today for the first time since he left the presidency. And what he talked about is that we as a people, ordinary people is the way he put it, when we get together to do things, we can do great things if we do them together. And so, there's going to be challenges in any democracy. There's going to be debates, there's going to be politics, but at least there's the opportunity for that to happen. Let me give you an example. So with No Child Left Behind, that was where my career started. My career started in Texas, working in the accountability department of Rod Page before he became Secretary of Education. Now, Texas likes to talk about being a local controlled place, but accountability, Texas style, is exactly the opposite of that. It's a top-down policy. It's controlled by just a few people. It's defined politically in terms of the structures and formulas of accountability and how it's implemented. Now, the thing is that that's a very top-down approach. Now, California has rethought this, and they have a more community-based democratic approach. It's called local accountability, and it's also tied to school finance. So that's just one example of a top-down education, quote-unquote. I know you have some critiques of reform, but education reform approach to testing and accountability, and a bottom-up, community-based, more democratic approach to accountability. And you can look across school reform and see approaches that are more democratic, more bottom-up than they are top-down and plutocratic.
So, this distinction between reformers and non-reformers, and between kind of, reform and grassroots stuff or whatever, to me never really plays out that way. Like it's great in a thematic sense to talk about it in those ways, but education just writ large is different in every state. It's governed by states. The state laws are very different. The way that they apply to local communities is very different. We have 14,000 school districts, and they have a range of kind of governance structures, the way that those local folks have decided that they want to arrange themselves. And none of them seem to produce the same thing, 100% negative or 100% positive. It just seems like a mixed bag, right? So you talked about the school board thing. Let's just think about Chicago, New York, and then what we have here in the Midwest, which is, we have good old-fashioned vanilla school boards. We elect our people. In New York and in Chicago, they both have this appointed situation, right? But they have two different attitudes from the community about it. When you tried to change it in New York, there was a lot of people on the left side of the aisle that didn't want to change it, right? Wanted mayoral control, and we have a very liberal mayor there who wanted to keep it. And Chicago's totally different story, completely different story about appointed. So are you thinking that just in general, appointed is bad? Let's just start there.
Well, I've had this conversation with Howard Fuller before, and I'm a big believer in direct democratic control. When a mayor is appointing a school board, there's a lot of other issues that come into play in any particular election. So the mayor is not feeling a lot of pressure. Rahm Emanuel is not feeling a lot of pressure necessarily in Chicago because of education is just one of many issues that voters are focusing on. Mm-hmm. So I think it's much better for us to have direct democratic control, direct accountability for our school boards. Now, this is, also complicated because, not every race has, competition for each slot. So, for example, in New Orleans, very few of the races actually had opponents. So the elections were called off for many of the seats, right? And I think that goes back to Michael Moore's conversation about, how do we approach this new era in democracy? And I think it's incumbent upon us to get involved in the democratic process. I think it was really interesting. Barack Obama was talking today, this first appearance I mentioned earlier, that he sees his new role as educating and organizing the next generation of Americans. And I think that we need to think about what this conversation about democracy and education looks like for the long term. Because if you shut young people out of these conversations, these democratic conversations, I think so often we as adults have these conversations, but I think we need to also include the young people and various parts of communities in these conversations about democracy and these different policies. We can't just have the usual suspects in the room. So I really think that Barack Obama is on the right track, and I think it's applicable to this conversation about democracy and education, too.
So one of the things that I see that, in a conversation like this between you and I, where I would have to come and be very candid is I see school board elections, I see them as low turnout affairs. I see that in states when you try to change the law on them being low turnout affairs and put them on the regular cycle with other elections, that oftentimes it's the school districts and their associations and the teachers unions that fight you on even making the change to make it more open. And I don't ever hear any real critique about that, right? I don't ever hear any kind of like when we do try to change the elections to make them higher turnout and higher engagement, the institution itself fights you on those things. Right now, it's actually best for the local people who want to keep things as they are in the institution to make sure that it stays under 11 or 12% and that most of the candidates are coming out of a very small pool of people who are endorsed in very small conventions that are mostly labor controlled, so that people can basically hire their own bosses into these, in Minneapolis, we have a $750 million budget for only, for something like 33,000 kids, which isn't, a lot of kids, but it's a lot of money. And school board, I think we're a pretty strong civic society, and school board just isn't very sexy to people to get involved with and engage. So it is, I think, in a lot of ways dominated by labor. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it, for example, in L.A., the race is highly competitive, highly politicized, and a lot of people are talking about what's happening there. Of course, the teachers, when you say teachers' unions, what we're actually talking about are the teachers.
No, those are two different things, though. Those are two different things.
Well, but you have the way so I spend a lot, so this is another thing that's interesting, is I'm asked by teachers associations to do a lot of things. And I'm sort of like the token academic. And I get to see like the democratic workings of these organizations and how messy they are and all the conversations that they have. And, these are very democratic organizations. In fact, they're like excessively democratic in terms of the inner machinations of how they function and the disagreements that they have internally. I mean, even on charter schools, teachers unions have organized thousands of charter school teachers. And so even within the organizations, there's a vigorous debate on where charter schools should go. And I've been around the table with unionized charter school teachers, and they have very vigorous and important debates about this within their organizations. I mean, they're very democratic organizations.
But you never really see that as a reflection in their agendas. I mean, you could go to almost any city. If there's a fight and pushback against charter schools, the teachers union is either very much involved or pushing it themselves. So, you may have people who disagree within the unions, but their agenda mostly comes out pretty universally the same.
Well, if you ask, I can think of 10 union folks off the top of my head that would give me exactly the opposite argument of the one that you just made, which is that they feel like the teachers' associations are too nice to charters and too supportive of charter schools because they're trying to organize charter schools all over California. And that's why they're democratic organizations, is that there is quite even state to state. And I'm in the room with these folks. I mean, there are some states that are very pro-charter in the teachers' unions, organizations, associations. And there are other states that are more critical.
I never see that. Nowhere. So where's an example of that, where the teachers' union are actually supportive of charter schools?
Well, it turns out that CTA is CTA is the California Teachers Association, is very interested in organizing charter schools.
They're interested in getting new members from charter schools, but they're also up at the state capitol pushing every anti-charter law that's being proposed.
Well, so I don't. That's a great question. So I don't see the laws as being anti-charter. So let me give you one example. one of the I was at a briefing just this Friday about transparency and accountability laws. So there's a belief out there that charters should report their school discipline rates for black and brown boys, that we should know the teacher attrition rates in charter schools, that just generally the same data that in charter schools should be available to the public. I think most people believe that information should be available to the public and should be available to parents so that they can make good decisions for their children and for their families. That's one of the bills that the Teachers Association supports and that the Charter Association is against. I think most people believe that we should have open meetings, and I've heard your critique of this for school boards, which is that, well, school boards work their ways around this, but so do all politicians. But we want to set a standard that is fair and just. So there's public meetings, legislation pending, and so the thing is that I don't think you see from teachers' organizations things that are unreasonable. I don't think you've seen legislation in California that says we should shut down all charter schools.
Well, right now there's a bill that says basically we'll cut off the due process. So, the way it works right now is if a district doesn't authorize you, you can go to a county and have another attempt at it. And there's a bill right now to stop that from happening.
Well, so the thing about that is I think about, I know you have kids. And so the thing is that sometimes your kids, they ask you for something and you say no. And then they might go to your partner and say, could we have this candy? And your partner will say no. And then you go to your neighbor and ask. No, that would never happen. But that's how the authorization process is set up here, which is that if the district says no, then you go to the county. If the county says no, then you can leave the community and go to the state board, right? So I think there is a lot of
So what's wrong with that, though? Actually, with your own lens of democracy, you can want an abortion and your local area can tell you no, and you can fight it in court, and the court can tell you no. So then you go to a bigger court, and that bigger court says no, and then you eventually end up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that this is your right. So,
but the courts, the courts are all set up under the same system, right? The state board is different from the county, which is different from the locally elected school board. So you're going through different systems that have been put in place via different processes, right? So I do think this is something I'm still thinking about, and I don't know if I have an answer for it. But the current conversation right now about authorizing is that people believe that that charter schools should be locally authorized and locally run. And I'm sympathetic to those concerns. I don't know where I am yet on that, but that is the current because in California, for example, what's happening is there are charter schools that are like satellite charter schools. So you can go to a district that is 700 miles away, let's say, and say, I want to start a charter school in San Diego. You can basically get a franchise, and then that district will get a cut of the money from the charter school, even though the district's 700 miles away. So I'm very sympathetic to the fact that there are a lot of abuses in California relative to how charter schools are being set up and how they're being authorized, and we need to tweak it. And I think this is a bigger concern. This is one of the things I've been thinking about. Is, if you look at the research literature on charters and especially vouchers, I think that it's in the best interest of people who are big supporters of these approaches to allow accountability and transparency. Because what happens is when we don't have that, the research bears out that there's a lot of bad actors out there, and it brings down the performance of the sector in general. I think that's, there's lots of horror stories, for example, coming out of Milwaukee. And so that's what happens with the Milwaukee research, is that there are, of course, some folks that are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But because the bad apples are being protected by good apples, what happens is that all of the research on average shows that vouchers are having no impact, and in the case of New Orleans, for example, a negative impact on students. So I think it's actually in the best interest of people who support school choice to support transparency and accountability measures, because in the long run, it will be good for them, and the research will look better because the bad apples will have to straighten up.
Well, so, I certainly 100% agree with that because I'm all about accountability. This is what I'm about. I wake up every day thinking about 8 million black children walking into public schools. And when I think about that, it's really just about them. I don't care what the building looks like. I don't care what governance structure it's under. I don't care what their testing scheme is. What I do care about is that we get some good across the board data so that we can answer this one essential question. It's an old African proverb. How are the kids? Right? So for no other reason than that, I would like some comparative kind of things. So when you say a lot of what you just said, you got my head shaking yes, right? Like I'm with you, right? But the thing about it is, would Burger King ever take advice from McDonald's, right? Because when I hear people who are traditional district supporters and they spend 90% of their time talking about schools that only educate 7% of the kids, it makes me wonder if it's not just a major distraction from what's happening to the majority of that 8 million students who are walking into public schools every day that have a few research things that we know for sure. We know for sure that more than 80% of the teachers are white. We know that white teachers have vastly different academic standards for black students. We know that minority students get the least effective teachers. We know that white teachers have totally different expectations than black teachers, and they tend to see black boys especially as older than they actually are. We also know that it's our best prepared kindergartners, black kindergartners, that lose the most ground in their first couple of years in school. We know that it's our high achieving black students in high school that lose the most ground between ninth grade and the end of high school. So some of this is just about institutional racism to me. It's not about charter versus non-charter, reform versus non-reform. It's really about how are black kids doing. And in the major system, there are so many things going wrong that I would think your argument that you just made, like supporters of the traditional district, would do themselves a real favor by admitting what is going on in their own schools and doing something about it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we disagree from when you started that point till now. I do think there's a couple of just interesting things to mention there. I think, one, there was some new research out last week, and I did tweet it, that the percentage of minority teachers is now up to around 20%, about a 10% increase over the last 10 or 15 years. So I think that's a plus
Well,
for
stick
us.
on that for a second. How many of those are black? It's like 4%, right?
I don't know. I didn't look. I could look it up.
Yeah, I
don't
think
know
it's
exactly
like 4% and it's 2% black males. Prior to Brown, most black children in America were being educated by black teachers, by black educators.
But I mean, I don't even have to tell you what happened in New Orleans to black educators after Katrina. I mean, you're very aware of what happened there. I don't know if we need to relitigate that.
Well, we do need to add this one piece. 84% of the teachers who were hired in the initial charter schools after Katrina were from the old system. 84% came from the old system.
Right, but we also have to know that 1,000 black teachers were pushed out of New Orleans after Katrina. So, I mean, there's that too. And it's not just that.
Yeah, actually more than 1,000, with the big firing that everybody talks about, but there were no schools. Yeah. You have no buildings.
Well, Martin Luther King, which is in the 9th Ward, I spent some time there, and this is how they explained that situation to me. After Katrina, they said they wouldn't open them unless they opened as a charter. And as you know, they protested that. They weren't even going to open their school, and then they said they would open if they opened it as a charter. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff about Katrina, and, for your listeners, the NAACP just had a hearing in New Orleans as a part of their quality education hearing.
I was there.
Commission.
Interestingly enough, I was there.
And that was a very vibrant discussion.
Yes, it was.
And you got a variety of perspectives on, how folks feel about the approach in New Orleans. So, anyways, what were we talking about before I got sidetracked about?
Just the systemic issues, especially institutional racism things, where we do have gold standard research that proves to us it's true in the main system, and it's affecting the majority of black students.
So I agree with you that structural inequality is entrenched in our society. It's unfortunate. Paulo Freire says that it's on purpose. I agree with that, and I agree that that we need to think about how to provide communities with what they need to educate their kids. There's a really interesting study by Kirabu Jackson, who is an economist at Northwestern University. I invite you to take a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, he studied every single district in the United States relative to school finance reform.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found was that in states that reformed their school finance and provided more resources to school, that they overwhelmingly increased their results. By almost, in some cases, a half a standard deviation of results, which is a pretty big impact. Most education reforms are in like the hundredths of a standard deviation. This was a half a standard deviation of impact or so. So it's clear that the system is rigged. Students, as they express in New Orleans, they understand the system is rigged, and it has been for a long time. So that's definitely some place where we agree. Now, what we do about it, and what the governance is, and who controls the system, and what the levers are, I think is where a lot of the debate comes into play. But just one more piece of good news, which is that what a lot of people don't talk about is that the NAEP, even for African Americans, is up over the last 30 years. Our public education system is doing a better job than it's ever done. That being said, we know that there are still severe inequalities in our system, and districts that are having challenges. There's no doubt about it. But
this is what I think is really hurtful about what you just said, though. I've heard you say this before about, our education system is doing, really kind of a bang-up job in a lot of ways. I think you mentioned like states like Massachusetts would be kind of high up better than Finland in some ways. And that type of statement is dependent on you saying, if it weren't for those kids, we would be the tops in the world. Right? If we only had white students with two parents who were college educated, we would be the best in the world. So by extension, it's only those other kids dragging us down. And by no measure can we say that urban public school districts are doing anything laudable in terms of outcomes. We are sending a high population of black people onto welfare and into prisons. Myron Orfield, who I'm sure you know, years ago did a study about which high schools were sending kids mostly to prison, and didn't release it because it had some pretty kind of ugly implications for what you would do to schools once you have that information. But we're not doing that well, right?
Well, I mean, again, I hope that wasn't your takeaway. I hope your takeaway wasn't that we're blaming certain kids because Massachusetts is not number one. I think what we're saying is that our system overall performs well. In fact, it performs really well for certain kids,
for white ones, right?
Sure, for anyone who's advantaged. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not laying any blame whatsoever. What it is saying is that our system does function well. You don't have to go to Finland to see what types of investments and what types of approaches you need to be successcul.
And what do you think those are?
Well, I mean, there's a long list of things, I think, but I think the overall overarching conversation, which is that we need community-based approaches. So I was in Las Vegas last week talking with educators about how we do community-based reform.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I consider myself an education reformer.
No,
I'm
come
just not,
on, man.
I'm just not a top-down education reformer. I believe that there are a variety of reform approaches that we can implement that are community-driven. So I don't think you have to. I don't think education reform has to be plutocratic or has to be top-down. There's a variety of things we can do. So one of the things I've already mentioned, which is the local accountability, which is strategic approaches focused on low SES kids, foster kids, and English language learners that California has undertaken the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. And not only do they have these accountability plans, but the state has provided extra funds so that those plans are extra strategic planning documents where you are spending these extra funds targeted on specific groups of students that are historically underperforming.
So are you seeing outcomes from that, though? Because this is what I think. You and I agree on a ton of stuff. Pre-K,
sure.
Universal preschool, 100%.
Sure.
I fought for it here in Minnesota, lost badly. right? In a very liberal state, we lost badly on universal pre-K. And my argument was we need to get as many, 4-year-olds at least into full-time care with certified teachers as possible, right? And we should put the state on the hook to fund it. But you point to a place like Oklahoma that already has it, and what people push back on you on is the outcomes are still not great in Oklahoma for students, right?
Okay, so it depends on what kind of outcomes you're thinking about. So let me keep going a little farther. So in these LCAPs, they're called Local Control Accountability Plans, you can you spend these funds. So some districts across the state have focused on restorative justice. What does restorative justice address? It addresses exactly what you were talking about, which is the school and prison pipeline. California has a huge problem, as many other states have a problem, suspending black and brown boys and many kids of many other different types, but especially black and brown boys. So suspensions are down by several 100,000 over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so this isn't chump change. LA is spending like $5 million. You have small districts like Oakland, Stockton. And so I don't think the only outcomes we care about are test scores. The fact that we are suspending hundreds of thousands less kids with the strategic local approach, I think is definitely a positive outcome. And that's what the LCAPs, which are these local accountability plans, allow you to do. You set goals as a local community. Test scores can be a part of that conversation, but I think we become so enamored with test scores because of what happened with NCLB and what happened in Texas and all those other things, that outcome becomes one of our primary measurements of everything.
Well, you know why I'm so into it, really, to be very honest with you? First of all, when you talk to parents, the number one thing that you hear often is safety, that they care about. Long before you get to test scores or anything else, there's other things that parents care about, right? Is my child going to be safe during the day? Is my child going to be treated well while I'm at work? And do I have to worry, when I'm at work?
Sure.
Those type of things are top of mind. You get into test scores. I think it's always a bad criticism of reformers that all they care about are test scores, right? I just think that's a very clever way of trying to say we should diminish the importance of outcomes, right? So test scores, tell me something that's really important about math and reading, because I think those are essential building blocks. And they tell me that black students, we need to do much better to get them much further along, because prisons are full of people that have high rates of illiteracy, right? So, so you should watch. It's not the only thing you watch, but if kids can't read, right?
Yeah, no,
I agree. It's important.
I agree. I gave a graduation address at Folsom Prison maybe 2 weeks ago, and we know that more than 50% of the folks in Folsom Prison can't read.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty typical. But there was some good news there. There were 50 black men graduating with lots of different honors. A couple from college, a couple from their associates. Some were receiving literacy certificates, other Microsoft certificates, etc. So that's clearly a challenge for us.
That's good news. But this is what I noticed about you. You see the bright side of everything. So this is what I'm starting to notice is you see the good news. I see, probably a more suspicious way of looking at the systems, right? I do think there are lots of great stories coming out of those places, but I want a backwards plan from when you are 19 or 20 or 21 or 22 and society's finding no use for you, and go back a few years, maybe even 12 years, and say, what could we have done differently to make sure that you at least get what you need when you graduate to do something productive in this society. And I think even you, in seeing the good news and all these things, would have to agree that's one of the major American problems that we have to fix.
No, I don't disagree about that. But I also think that, when I go speak to folks, that, a lot of times, it's like when you come home and, you want to hear the good news or the bad news first. There's bad news and there's good. You got to give both.
Right.
And I don't think we disagree on the bad news, but I think where we have to, you can't fight something with nothing is the old political adage.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have, and for me, we have a special standard, which is that because I'm a professor, we have to have things that are empirically based and have data behind them. That's a special responsibility that we have to society. So, when I make these presentations about community-based approaches, of course, we're focused on outcomes. Right now, some of the newer stuff is going to be not peer-reviewed yet because that takes some time. But over time, you'll have the short. So, for example, on the LCAP stuff, the local accountability stuff, there are a lot of like WestEd and a lot of other organizations that already have early data that is positive on this local approach to accountability. Over the long term, we'll gather there'll be peer-reviewed studies, et cetera. So the restorative approaches have a long history of and backing of research on them. Another one is the community schools. A lot of folks, I'm not against choice.
Yes, you are. You are really, though, right?
But no, I'm not. What I really think is important for families is to have high-quality neighborhood choices where they have a say in how those schools function.
Now, let's stick with this for a second, though, okay? Because I know the part that you think is really important about that is where they have an actual say in it, and I agree with you. But this is one of the things I find with traditional kind of supporters of district and traditional schooling, is that you, on one hand, have the Myron Orfield and Gary Orfields of the world that tell us so much about segregation in schools. And then you have this kind of national push around neighborhood schools. We just want strong neighborhood schools. Those are talking out both sides of your neck when you're that person, because you can't have both, right? What Myron's plan requires you to do is expand the territory and get kids out of their neighborhood, right? And that's what we've got in Minnesota. We bus kids out to the suburbs and not pay attention to what it does to neighborhood schools. And at the same time, the neighborhood school push in Minneapolis, for instance, came from the white affluent parents who wanted to get kids out of their schools and send them back to their neighborhoods. So these two things, community-based neighborhood schools sounds great, but this segregation, we need to integrate all kids, whatnot, also sounds great, but they don't work together.
Yeah. So, I don't usually quote Howard Fuller. But,
no, you don't.
But I actually thought he gave a great speech in Las Vegas this last week when I was there. And one of the things he said was, someone asked me, do I think that economic reform or education reform is more important? And he said economic reform, which I'm like, okay, I agree with that. Now, one of the interesting things is that the mayor of Houston has realized this. I think Secretary Castro realized this, which is that neighborhoods have to be alive and vibrant. And when you do that, people of all different types will live there. And so he is, in Houston, they're embarking on neighborhood reform, because when you have parks, when you don't have a food desert, when you are, you have community approaches to policing, these are all things that are important to create vibrant communities that attract people of different types. So I'm not naive enough to think that for some people, especially during the segregation era, that neighborhood schools was a code word for we want to keep our schools all white.
And it is still, right? I mean, in some cities like Minneapolis, it's still code word for we don't want those kids on our side of town. That was the push for neighborhood community. Like, if we just make every school great is what the pitch was to Minneapolis people. If we just made every school great, it would be awesome. They wouldn't have to come over here.
I don't find myself necessarily against busing. Now, what's interesting is that Alice Huffman, who's California NAACP chair, she thought that busing was a terrible idea.
Right.
And Howard Fuller, the same.
Right.
He's made comments about that. So, no, I'm not saying that busing was the best decision we made in education policy. But we need to think about that, our schools are segregated. And the research says that charter schools are even more segregated than our traditional public schools.
Which I disagree with, right?
Well, the thing is that I looked at this myself. I looked at this in Texas, and we published this in the Stanford Law and Policy Review. If you do geospatial analysis and look at schools that are nearby, not overall averages, that's the case. If you look at Gary Orfield's study, the charter schools are 16% more segregated. But we know why they're segregated because of the way schools sit, which is the same problem that we have with traditional public schools. So I think the challenge that we have.
Well, wait a second now. Stick with that for a second. Parent choice plays a big part in this, right? So when we talk about the traditional meaning of segregation, this is the part that I disagree with. We are abusing that term because segregation in history and in tradition has been the government assignment by race to inferior conditions, right? That is the historic and traditional understanding of segregation that underpins most of the law that we talk about. Parents who seek out culturally affirming or family affirming, meaning it's for other values, schools on their own and gaining access to those schools is not segregation. That's not, especially when you're talking about historically marginalized populations like African Americans, Native Americans, Latino communities. They have a special claim even to make a choice for the type of schools that they want.
Well, yeah. Here's the thing about this, is that the grandfather of school choice was Milton Friedman. He actually thought about it.
That was before him, though. It was before him. He was the godfather of vouchers, but before him there was school choice. And the oldest voucher program in the United States is from the 1600s, and it's still going. It's the longest continuing one in Maine.
So the true believers. Well, we also know why. I mean, that's a different case. I mean, in Maine, the district. I went to Maine and I spoke there a few months ago, and so they explained how the voucher system works there, and it's because some communities are so absolutely so small that they have to combine their resources to do it. It isn't a social justice or a neoliberal thing. It's an economy of scale approach in Maine. So Maine has like 13 charter schools. So we talked about this in the debate a couple of weeks ago. Maine's not the best case for education reform because it's such a small and unique place. But so the true believers in it, and here's the thing, is that there are people in the education choice conversation that fall into different camps, I'm sure.
Definitely.
There are some people that are interested in education choice because they truly believe that it's a civil rights, that it affords parents something better. I mean, they truly believe that. Then there are other people that are in this school choice conversation that are all about profit and privatization, right? And that's where Milton Friedman was, and that's where a lot of the true believers that are on the neoliberal side come from. And Milton Friedman said very specifically that with school choice, you could keep schools segregated because he didn't believe that people should have to allow their kids to go to school with other kids at different times.
So this is the part of the discussion where I think, and you've got background in history, so there's different tracks that you could take with the discussion we're having right now. We could talk about the completely white track and the right-wingers and their history from today going all the way back to the beginning of time. We could also just stick with black traditional thought, going all the way back to the first slaves that came out of slavery and what they cared about. And I would say those are different conversations, right? Because what's in the body of work of black people and black thinkers and black intellect includes school choice, going back very far, as a matter of fact. It includes black schools. It includes schools built by the community and ran by the community, and they chose their own teachers. It includes, like Kenneth Clark in 1968, describing that there had to be an entirely alternative system of public education because it wasn't meeting our needs. Kenneth Clark from the famous Brown versus Board case and did the famous doll test. That's what he wrote in 68. So I'm just trying to say we shouldn't mix lanes, because we could have the right-wing discussion, and that would be different than the black history discussion.
So I think that community schools, community-based approaches to different governance forms, in-district charters, magnets, because there are some districts, like, for example, Miami, is finding a lot of success with in-district school choice, with pre-K, with principals as instructional leaders, with finding additional resources from the community to fund these different approaches. So there are districts that are having lots of success, but you don't hear us talking about them like you hear us having conversations about Chicago or New Orleans or Newark or some of these other places.
That depends on who you're talking to, right?
But the question is, are market-based approaches the best, where we have nonprofit and for-profit corporations running schools, whether it be with vouchers or with charters? I mean, if you look at what Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or W. Du Bois, they all had very specific beliefs about markets and capital approaches to education policy. Malcolm X called these approaches blood-sucking, right? So,
and let me just stop you there. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, their kids went to the best private schools, as did Jesse Jackson's and a large percentage of the Congressional Black Caucus.
but I don't think that indicts their belief.
You don't? There's a difference between what people say and what they do. You don't think that's an indictment?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Really?
If you are a person that is a hardcore Catholic,
Yeah.
and you want your kid to have the catechism and prayer in school, why would you criticize somebody for sending their kid to a parochial school for parochial reasons? Now, I've heard people tell me that they send their kids to private school because they don't want their kids to go to school with kids of other types.
Which seems like the number one reason that a lot of folks do it, right?
Because they don't like teachers' unions, or because
right.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons out there why people send. But why indict any person, anybody else, because they have sincere religious beliefs that they are creationists, that they want prayer in school? I don't see why we'd indict people.
Well, I don't want to indict them, but I do want to say I think you're misusing them in some ways. First of all, Malcolm X said only a damn fool turns over their students or their kids to their enemy to educate them, right? And in large part, he was talking about us putting our black kids in white schools. So that's what Malcolm X said. Martin Luther King said to two black educators who asked him, "I believe in integration for all things, except for public education, because I think in that case we are dealing with our most precious item, which is the intellectual development of our young girls and boys. And we can't turn that over to people who think so little of us." That's what Martin Luther King said.
But we also have to know that there's a lifetime of work of both individuals. And of course, Martin Luther King later said that segregation, that he was critical of segregation. I think, and Malcolm, as his life went on, he became more tolerant and believing of integrative approaches. So, yeah, I understand that. If you look across my history, if you looked at me 15 years ago, I was a charter parent, and I was a charter educator, and I was on the charter school board. But I think that over time, you could come across information and evidence that changes your mind. So I think we have to look at the full scope of their experience.
Well, so I want to put a pin in that because we're coming to an end, and I have the most the biggest question I want to ask you. But I'll say this: we really should pick lanes when we have these discussions, because there are many things that organically have grown out of the black community that form black educational thought, all the way from the first folks like Lucy Laney, who chartered a school in the 1800s, all the way to a person like Tim King today, and in between people like Marva Collins and others. We have our own tradition to talk about, and it forms an educational ideology that I think includes a lot of the things that you're against. But that leads me to the question that I would most want to ask you, which is, you and I have disagreed on a lot of things, but your focus primarily in your scholarship has been around charter schools and vouchers and testing, and a lot on Teach for America. And I just wonder why those are the top educational issues for your scholarship when it actually really affects so few in comparison to the majority of our kids that are having an issue.
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, there's other work that I do, too. So, I've had work cited in Supreme Court cases on college education and college access. I also do work on English language learners, immigrant students, which affects a fifth of all students in many states, and some states more.
Even more,
so
yeah.
I don't think that I don't see myself as restricted. I mean, that's what's great about being a faculty member, is that you have the ability to follow your curiosity. And so what I'm really focused on right now is thinking about community-based reform that are showing positive outcomes and that empower families and ordinary people to do great things. So, and that's the book that I'm working on. So is
the headline to that, let me ask this question, because let's keep this honest.
Okay.
Is the headline, there's this really great way to do education, and it's actually a good reason why you shouldn't do charter schools testing this? Is it? I guess my question is it just shown to be an alternative, or just because it's good in itself?
So, I have allies that think that all testing is bad and that all charters are bad.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that all charters are bad and that all testing is bad. I think low-stakes formative and summative assessments are a great idea, especially if they're community-driven and not, outsourced to for-profit testing companies. I think they're great and interesting charter schools. I just saw a film, Beyond Measurement, that profiled an interesting charter school that was doing project-based approaches, and they were actually living up to this. We're going to share innovative approaches with schools across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting. But I don't think that large-scale for-profit and nonprofit corporations running large chain schools is the best idea for our public education system.
Well, let me give you one last, because I do want to wrap. But, on that point, that there's so few for-profit charter schools that it annoys me that we talk about them so often as if they're everywhere and they're ever present. It's like 15% tops of charter schools. Yeah. So it's almost like being with the spouse who always wants to pick out the one thing that you do wrong. You didn't take the trash out. But to wrap, here's something you heard me say when we were in our debate, which was this thing around the moratorium on charter schools. I get annoyed when I've seen people be against every kind of school, be against magnet schools. For instance, when I was on the school board, there was an active group of parents that wanted us to stop the magnet schools because they thought they were bad. All the different kinds of schools, it had somebody, like our small schools. We had a couple of small schools they tried to close every year, like a holiday, just it's time to close those schools. Sure. So there's bias and prejudice about certain types of schools. But this moratorium thing on the charter school, you heard me say to Ms. Huffman, who stood up at our debate and asked a question, that I thought if black intellectuals and scholars were serious about all of this, we wouldn't be talking about charter schools or vouchers or Teach for America. We would be taking a totally different angle, which is maybe we would pull together everybody nationally who has information on what is working for black children. We would ask them to bring their evidence and be able to demonstrate. And we would answer the one simple question of what works for educating black kids, and we would form an agenda based on that. What would be so wrong with going with that approach rather than the political approach?
Well, I think the answer is all of the above. I mean, on Wednesday, I'm going to San Antonio for ARA. It's the biggest education research conference. 17,000 people. So there will be a lot of high-quality research there, and there's no reason why you couldn't convene a conversation in a place like that to look for some best practices. But just on the moratorium thing, I think it's really important. If you read the moratorium, it's talking about making sure that families can actually do the choosing. If I choose Harvard, for example, they also have to choose me. It's a two-way choice. Now, what I believe we need to think about is how to ensure that whether you're charters or whether you're a traditional public school, that choice is always a one-way choice and not a two-way choice.
What's that mean?
Parents and families should always be doing the choosing.
Okay.
Charters and traditional schools should not find ways to what we call creaming, which is making sure, and this is where I critique magnets, is that we need to make sure we have open access magnets. That's creaming. Cropping is when once kids are already there, finding ways to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. And that applies to traditional schools and charter schools. We need choice to be a one-way street, not a two-way street.
So are you against enrolling kids by their home address, for instance?
Well, I understand, as a former district person, I understand the difficulties of transportation. But most district lines are not due to transportation. For example, in Texas, most district lines are still drawn because of the segregationist path.
I think in most states, the educational gerrymandering is what causes the redlining of the black mind. So the I had a PhD years ago tell me, Chris, the fairest way you could probably enroll kids is by random lottery across the board, right? Just random assignment.
So we've looked at this. Berkeley has an approach, and we wrote a piece in the Berkeley Review Law and Education or something like that, where they do reassignment based on census tracts with some preference to local. So, and we looked at every district in the United States and said, if you do this, can you create more equity across schools? And our answer was yes, and I can forward you that paper. But the challenge is with the practicality, which is the transportation. So that's why we need to think about how we make neighborhoods healthy, because that's how you create multi-ethnic, multi-economic neighborhoods. And that's the kind of neighborhood I live in.
But it's not going to happen, right? Like I just was in Detroit for that NAACP thing there, and if I was a parent there right now, I'm not waiting for I got to make school choices right now, right? I'm not waiting for the neighborhood to come back, because there's parts of Oakland, there's parts of New Orleans still, there's parts of New Orleans that still aren't rebuilt from Katrina after $42 billion of FEMA money going through that city. There's a way in which we can talk about the world we want, and then there's a way in which we have to live in the world we're in.
Sure. So, there's short-term and long-term approaches. There's no doubt about it. I think some of the short-term approaches is how we bring conversations about community schools and what it takes to address the needs of students of different types. That's a right-now solution. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. Promise neighborhoods and these whole healthy communities approaches, I think, are shorter and longer-term solutions.
All right. Well, I actually I don't disagree. I agree 100% with community-based schools, with community types of schools. I'm frankly somebody who's open, though, to a wide range of schools. So I get nervous when people have one kind that they want to pitch to me, either micro schools or Montessori or community-based schools or, charter schools or whatever. I'm not a one kind of school guy. I've got 3 kids in a traditional neighborhood public school right now. I've also been a private school parent and a charter school parent at different times. So I just want the options. I just want to be able to choose for myself and not have, very learned people prescribe from me from very high levels what options I should have, right? So that's what I hear a lot of. That's what I respond to a lot of when we have discussions, is like, I'm not disagreeing with a lot of the things that you are for. I'm just like a lot of people, I don't want you cutting off avenues that you don't appreciate, but I might.
I see where you're coming from. I think the broader concern is how we ensure transparency and accountability for all schools. I think that there are some, a laissez-faire approach to charters or to vouchers is not in the best interest of our nation. I think that the results from having a laissez-faire approach have been dismal. So I think that to ensure the success of all kids, we just need to make sure that we have the transparency and accountability for all schools.
Well, I'm going to let us wrap on that point, because I agree. We do need, and I want to say to my listeners, this is a point of agreement for us, which is schools have to be accountable and the public has to understand what the information about schools is. We have to do a very good job of translating the information and putting it into real people terms so people understand, the quality of the schools around them. And Julian, you and I agree on it is more than just the test scores, those outcomes. There are a lot people care about safety. They care about size of school and these other things. So that's a point of agreement. I hope that you feel like it was a fair discussion and not an ambush. I'm so thankful that you agreed to come on today and appreciate that.
I'm okay with ambushes too, but I'm always up for a good conversation.
I appreciate it, man. And you haven't blocked me on Twitter, which is, fairly remarkable, because a lot of people around you who claim to be for democracy have blocked me and you haven't. So I actually appreciate that too. Man, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
All right, have a great day.
You too. Thanks, man. To my listeners, I want to say this has been another episode of Citizen Stewart Rock the Schools. In a couple of shows, we're going to have a major, major announcement. So you should keep listening to us so that you can find out what that major announcement is. It's going to be not that long from now in a couple of shows. But keep listening. I want to end this show the way that I end every show, which is to remind you that our kids are born with unsurpassable worth granted to them by a mighty, mighty God. It's our job every day to fulfill that, to wake up as like revolutionaries and think, what can we do to answer the question, how are the kids? Thank you for listening.